I've been a mine safety inspector for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection for 11 years. Before that, I worked 6 years as an underground surveyor for a private coal company in Fayette County. 17 years total spent in holes that most people don't know exist, mapping passages that were sealed before their grandparents were born. I want to be specific about my credentials, because what I'm going to describe needs to sit on a foundation you can trust. I'm not a storyteller. I write reports, I measure subsidence, I calculate the probability that the ground beneath a housing development will collapse into a room and pillar void that hasn't seen light since 1938. That's what I do. I measure what's under things. The inspection that changed everything was a routine re-entry assessment in Cambria County, about 12 miles southeast of Ebensburg. A landowner named Kowalczyk had filed a subsidence complaint. Cracks in his basement floor, a door that wouldn't close anymore, his well water turning the color of weak tea. Standard indicators. We get maybe 40 of these a year across the bituminous region. Most of them trace back to old workings that were mapped decades ago, but never properly sealed. You go in, you confirm the void geometry matches the historical maps. You assess pillar integrity, you write a remediation recommendation, and you move on. The mine in question was listed in the state database as the Harwick Loss No. 4, operated by Consolidated Fuel from 1921 to 1953. Room and pillar extraction, Pittsburgh seam, average depth about 240 feet. The original maps were on file. Hand-drawn survey sheets showing roughly 11 miles of developed passage radiating from 2 shaft entries on the northeast side of a ridge. Both shafts had been sealed with concrete caps in 1961 as part of a federal closure program. There was also a drift entry on the south slope, sealed with a rubble plug and a concrete block wall. I brought Danny Terrazas with me. Danny had been with the department 3 years. Former Army combat engineer, then a civil engineering degree at Penn State, then us. He was quiet, methodical, built like someone who'd spent his 20s carrying heavy things up hills, and he had a quality I valued in underground work. He didn't fill silence with talk. Some people can't stand the weight of a mine around them and compensate by narrating everything. Now Danny just watched and measured. I trusted him. We entered through the drift on March 11th. The rubble plug had partially failed, water infiltration had dissolved the binding in the concrete blocks, and a section about 3 feet wide had slumped inward, leaving a gap. This was actually useful. It meant we didn't need to arrange a formal unsealing. We just needed to widen the gap enough to pass through with our equipment, which took about 20 minutes with a pry bar and a small pneumatic hammer. The air quality readings at the portal were acceptable. Oxygen at 20.1%, no detectable methane, carbon monoxide at 2 parts per million, hydrogen sulfide below detection. Temperature was 54 degrees, which was normal for that depth in that region. We tagged the entry with a GPS point, logged the time, 8:47 a.m., and went in. And the first 300 feet of passage were what you'd expect. The coal had been mined in rooms about 20 feet wide with pillars left every 40 feet, creating a grid pattern. The roof was competent sandstone with some shale laminations. Floor was underclay, damp but firm. Rail ties were still visible under a few inches of sediment, and we found the remains of a wooden brattice, a ventilation partition, that had mostly rotted but was still recognizable from the nail pattern. Nothing unusual. I've been in dozens of mines that looked exactly like this. At about 500 feet in, we reached a junction where the main haulage way split into 2 headings. According to the 1953 closure map, the left heading ran about 2,200 feet to the northwest before terminating at a fault, The right heading continued south-southwest for over a mile and connected to the bulk of the developed workings. We needed to reach the area beneath Kowalczyk's property, which the map placed along the right heading, roughly 3,200 feet from the drift entry. We went right. By 1,000 feet in, the conditions were still textbook. The pillars were holding. The roof showed no significant sag. There was standing water in some of the crosscuts, maybe 8 inches deep, clear, cold, slightly mineral-smelling. We documented everything with photographs and survey measurements, tying each station back to the GPS point at the portal. I want to establish this because I need you to understand the baseline. A mine that's been sealed for 60-plus years develops a kind of equilibrium. The air stabilizes. The water finds its level. The biological activity drops to near zero. No insects, no fungi beyond some white bacterial mats on wet surfaces, no sound except dripping water and the faint elastic groaning of rock under load. You learn to read a mine by what it's doing. A stable mine is quiet. A mine that's about to move tells you if you know how to listen. Harwick Lost number 4 was quiet. Until it wasn't. At roughly 2,800 feet from the entry, Danny stopped. He didn't say anything. He just stopped walking and held up his left hand, which was our signal for listen. I stopped. We stood in the passage with our cap lamps cutting 2 cones of light into the dark, and we listened. There was a sound. It was faint and low, somewhere below the threshold where you can identify what's making it. Not dripping, not rock stress. It was rhythmic, a pulse, maybe 2 cycles per second, with a slight variation in amplitude. It sounded like it was coming from ahead of us, but sound does strange things underground. Hard surfaces create reflections, and channels that can make a noise from behind you seem like it's coming from the wall beside you. I checked my instruments. Oxygen was still good. Methane was 0. The atmosphere was clean. Fan, Danny said. That was a reasonable first guess. Old mines sometimes had ventilation fans that ran on small electric motors. If one had somehow been left connected to a power source, a deeply unlikely but not impossible scenario, it could produce a rhythmic hum. But the mine had been off-grid since 1953. There was no power infrastructure within a quarter-mile of the property. No source, I said. Danny nodded. We stood for another 30 seconds. The sound continued, steady, even, almost mechanical in its regularity. But not quite. I logged it in my field notes as unidentified rhythmic sound, low frequency, bearing approximately south-southwest, source unknown. We continued. At 3,000 feet, the map said we should be approaching a series of rooms that extended eastward beneath the Kowalczyk parcel. And we were. I could see the openings on both sides of the haulage way, where rooms had been driven perpendicular to the heading. But there was something the map didn't show. The haulage way continued past the point where the map said it ended. This happens. Historical mine maps are frequently incomplete. Companies would drive exploratory headings that the surveyors never got around to mapping, or they'd extend workings after the final survey was completed. Finding unmapped passage is not alarming. It's actually useful data. It means the subsidence risk zone is larger than the records indicate, which changes the remediation calculus. What was unusual was the character of the passage beyond the mapped terminus. The rooms on either side, the ones that were on the map, had been mined in the standard fashion. 20-foot wide rooms, rough walls, tool marks visible in the coal pillars, roof bolts installed in a regular pattern. Standard mid-century bituminous mining. The passage beyond was different. The walls were smoother. The dimensions were more regular, not roughly 20 feet wide, but precisely, as if someone had gone back and trimmed the coal faces to a uniform dimension. The floor was cleaner, not just less sediment, actively clean, as though water had been channeled to flush it. And the roof was higher by about 2 feet, which meant either the seam thickened here or someone had cut into the overlying rock, which would be unusual. You don't waste effort mining rock. You mine coal. The rhythmic sound was louder here, not dramatically so, just present in a way it hadn't been before. I could feel it now, a faint vibration in the floor, rising through the soles of my boots. "This isn't on the map," Danny said. "No." "How far does it go?" I aimed my cap lamp down the heading. The beam reached maybe 200 feet before the passage curved gently to the left and disappeared. I couldn't see the end. I checked the time. It was 10:15 a.m. We'd been underground for about an hour and a half. Oz protocol said we had 8 hours of lamp time and 6 hours of breathable air reserve in our self-rescuers if something went wrong. We were well within operational limits. "Let's see," I said. We followed the passage for another 600 feet. It maintained its unusual regularity: smooth walls, clean floor, high ceiling. The curve continued, bending gradually to the south. I was keeping a compass bearing and distance log as we went, building a rough map in my notebook. Based on my calculations, we'd moved outside the boundary of the original mine workings entirely. We were now beneath a section of ridgeline that, according to the geological survey maps, had never been mined. I want to pause here and tell you something about what it's like to be in an unmapped passage deep underground. Every mine inspector has a relationship with maps. They're your lifeline. They tell you where the air is, where the water is, where the roof is likely to fail, and most importantly, how to get out. When you walk off the edge of a map, you lose all of that. You're in a space that, as far as the institutional record is concerned, does not exist. The rock doesn't care. The rock is the same whether it's mapped or not. But your brain cares. Your brain evolved to navigate using landmarks and spatial memory. And when every surface looks the same and extends in directions no one has documented, something in the back of your mind starts keeping track of how far you've gone and whether you can get back. I was keeping track. 600 feet past the end of the mapped workings. A gentle curve to the south, on total distance from the drift entry, roughly 3,600 feet. I could still find my way out. At approximately 4,200 feet from the entry, this is my best estimate based on the pace count, the passage opened up. I don't mean it widened into a larger room. I've seen that dozens of times. Room and pillar mines are full of large open spaces where pillars were pulled during retreat mining. What I mean is that the passage terminated at a wall of coal, and in that wall there was a hole. The hole was roughly 4 feet in diameter. It was at floor level, and it hadn't been drilled or blasted. The edges were irregular but clean, no tool marks, no blast fractures. It looked like the coal had been removed by hand or had fallen away naturally along a structural weakness. Through the hole, I could see open space. My lamp beam went in and didn't come back for a long time. Whatever was on the other side was large. The sound was coming from through the hole, louder now. The rhythm had resolved into something more complex than I'd initially perceived. It wasn't a single pulse. It was layered. Multiple frequencies, slightly offset, creating a kind of polyrhythmic hum. It still wasn't loud. You wouldn't have heard it in a room with a refrigerator running. But in the dead silence of a mine, it was the most prominent thing in the world. Danny crouched by the hole and aimed his lamp through it. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he leaned back and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face before. Danny was not an expressive person. His face tended to stay in a narrow range between neutral and mildly focused. when what I saw now was something closer to the expression of someone who has just been asked a question in a language they don't speak. "You need to look at this," he said. I got down on my hands and knees and looked through the hole. On the other side was a void, a large, open underground space. That was not unusual by itself. Karst geology produces natural caverns, and mining sometimes intersects them. But this void had geometry that natural caverns don't have. I was looking at a straight edge, a wall, vertical, flat, extending to the left and right beyond the reach of my lamp. It wasn't coal, it wasn't sandstone or limestone. It was a uniform medium gray, and it had a surface texture that looked almost like concrete. Smooth but not polished, with a fine granular structure. And it was vertical. Truly vertical. Not roughly vertical the way a natural fracture plane can be, but vertical the way a building wall is vertical. Below the wall, the floor of the void was flat. Not mine floor flat, where underclay gets packed down by traffic and water. Flat the way a poured slab is flat. The same gray material. I moved my light slowly to the right. The wall continued for maybe 50 feet, and then it turned. A corner. A 90-degree corner. "Danny," I said, "are you seeing this?" "I saw it." "What is this?" Danny didn't answer. He was checking his instruments again. Oxygen, 20.0. Methane, 0.0. CO, 1 parts per million. The air on the other side of the hole was clean. Let me explain what I was not thinking, because it matters. And I was not thinking about lost civilizations or secret government installations or any of the things that a person hearing this story might immediately jump to. I was thinking about 3 practical possibilities. First, this was an old underground structure related to mining, a sealed equipment room, a powder magazine, a pump station, that had been built with unusual care and then left off the maps. Second, this was a natural void that happened to have unusually regular geometry, which does occur in certain sedimentary sequences where bedding planes and joint sets intersect at right angles. Third, I was misreading what I was seeing, because a cap lamp 200 feet underground does not give you the same information as daylight. All 3 of these were plausible. I believed one of them had to be correct. I want to be honest about that. I was fitting what I saw into categories I already had. That's not a failure of observation. That's how the human mind works. You see something new, and you sort it into the closest existing bin. The problems start when the thing you're seeing doesn't fit any bin, and you keep sorting anyway. The hole was big enough to crawl through. I went first. Danny followed. The void was large. I stood up on the other side and swept my lamp in a full circle. The wall I'd seen from outside was part of a structure, a rectangular structure with 4 walls and a flat roof about 12 feet above the floor. It was roughly 30 feet wide and extended back into the darkness further than my beam could reach. There were openings in the wall at regular intervals, rectangular openings, the size and shape of doors. But there were no doors, no frames, just openings. I walked to the nearest one and aimed my light inside. A room, square, maybe 10 by 10, empty. The same gray walls, the same flat floor. No features of any kind, no shelves, no fixtures, no pipes, no wiring. Just a box made of a material I couldn't identify, 240 feet below the surface, inside a coal mine that had been sealed since 1961. Danny was beside me. He reached out and touched the wall. Then he pulled his hand back and looked at his fingers. "It's warm," he said. I touched it. He was right. Not hot. Not even notably warm by any standard you'd use above ground. But underground, everything is 54 degrees. The rock, the air, the water, the coal. Everything reaches the same ambient temperature over time. This wall was warmer than ambient, maybe 60 degrees, maybe 62. Enough to feel the difference through your fingertips. A warm wall means something is generating heat. In a mine, that usually means one of two things: an underground fire or decomposition of organic material. Both produce characteristic gases that I would have detected. Neither was present. The air was clean. I photographed the wall, the room, the opening, the floor. I took measurements. Danny did the same on the opposite side of the structure. We worked in silence for about 10 minutes, documenting what we were looking at with the thoroughness that comes from having no idea what you're looking at, and falling back on procedure because procedure is what you have. There were 12 openings in the wall I could count from where I stood. Behind each one, a room. Same dimensions, same emptiness, same warmth. The structure wasn't alone. Yet beyond it, separated by about 40 feet of flat gray floor, there was another one. Same dimensions, same openings, same rooms. And beyond that, another. My lamp wasn't powerful enough to show me how many there were, but the geometry was consistent as far as I could see. Rectangular structures arrayed in a grid, separated by uniform gaps, with rectangular openings facing the corridors between them. It looked like a street. I need to say that clearly because I spent a long time not saying it, even to myself, and the evasion didn't help me understand anything. It looked like a street lined with buildings that had rooms inside them. Not metaphorically, not with a little imagination. It looked like the most basic possible version of what a city block looks like, built from a single gray material, with no ornamentation, no signage, no variation, and no evidence of who built it or why or when. The rhythmic sound was everywhere here. It was in the floor and the walls and the air. Standing in the corridor between the first two structures, I could feel it in my chest. A low, steady, complex vibration that felt less like machinery and more like something breathing. Not literally breathing. I'm describing a subjective impression. But the rhythm had the quality of a biological process. Not perfectly regular, not random, but somewhere in between. "We need to go back and report this," Danny said. He was right. Standard protocol when you encounter unexpected conditions underground is to withdraw, document, and notify your supervisor, who escalates to the appropriate authority. If this was a previously unknown structure of any kind, and it was a significant find that needed to be assessed by people with expertise I didn't have. "Yeah," I said. "Let me get a distance measurement to the far end first." That was a reasonable professional request. It was also the first time I didn't follow the rule I should have followed, and I want to be honest about why. It wasn't fear or fascination, or any of the dramatic emotions you might expect. It was habit. When I'm in a void, I measure the void. That's my function. I walk to the walls, I note the dimensions, I calculate the volume. I was falling back on procedure because procedure was what I had, and the procedure said, "Get measurements." Danny stayed at the hole we'd come through. I walked south between the rows of structures. I counted them as I went. 5 on the left, 5 on the right. Then a gap, a cross corridor, and perpendicular to the one I was in, extending to the left and right. More structures visible down its length. Then 5 more on the left, 5 more on the right. Another cross corridor. A grid. Regular, systematic. The blocks were identical in dimension. The corridors were all the same width. The cross corridors were the same width as the main corridors. It was a grid the way a planned city is a grid. Not organic, Not grown, but designed. Imposed. At the third cross corridor, I stopped and aimed my lamp to the left. More structures, fading into the dark. I aimed it to the right. The same. I aimed it straight ahead. The corridor continued. More structures, more openings. The same gray material, the same warmth, the same sound. I tried to calculate the size of what I was standing in. Each block was roughly 30 feet wide and at least 100 feet long. Each corridor was about 40 feet wide. If the pattern continued for even 10 more blocks in each direction, this space was... I did the math in my head and then did it again because the first answer seemed wrong. Over a quarter mile across. A quarter mile. 240 feet underground. In a coal mine in Cambria County, Pennsylvania. I stood there and I tried to construct the explanation that would make this ordinary. A military installation. The government built underground facilities during the Cold War. I knew that. Maybe this was one of them. Built in secret, sealed, abandoned. The uniformity of the construction would support that. Military architecture is repetitive by design. The material could be some kind of poured aggregate I wasn't familiar with. The warmth could be geothermal, channeled through the floor by some system I couldn't see. I was building this explanation when I noticed something that took it apart. The floor had marks on it. Not tool marks, not construction marks. These were on the surface, like scratches or scuffs, and they were recent. How did I know they were recent? Because they were on top of the thin film of mineral dust that had settled on everything. Wherever the dust was undisturbed, the floor was uniformly gray. Where these marks were, the dust had been pushed aside, revealing a slightly different shade of gray underneath. A lighter gray, cleaner, as though the surface beneath the dust was newer than the surface around it. The marks were not random. They formed lines. Folders mostly straight, some curved, some intersecting. They were concentrated near the openings of the structures, as though something had moved in and out of the rooms and left tracks in the dust. I crouched down and examined one of the marks closely. It was about 2 inches wide and perfectly smooth-edged, as though made by something with a flat, firm bottom surface being dragged across the floor. Not a footprint, not an animal track, not a tool scrape, something I didn't have a category for. The marks were not old. In a sealed underground space, dust accumulates very slowly, maybe a fraction of a millimeter per year, depending on air movement. The dust film on the floor was thin, maybe a millimeter or two at most, which was consistent with 60-plus years of accumulation since the mine was sealed. But the marks had displaced this dust. Or they were on top of the timeline. They were the most recent thing that had happened on this floor. Something had moved here. After the mine was sealed, possibly recently. I took photographs. I measured the marks. I noted their distribution pattern, concentrated near the openings, sparser in the corridors, absent in the rooms themselves. Whatever had made them had been moving through the corridors and pausing at the doorways, but not entering the rooms. This is the point where I should have turned around. Not because I was in danger. I had no evidence of danger. The air was clean, the structure was sound. There was nothing threatening in any direction. I should have turned around because I had exceeded the scope of the inspection. I was in an unmapped space with no communication link to the surface. And I was making observations that I did not have the training or context to interpret. Every responsible protocol said, leave, document, escalate. I took 2 more steps forward, not because I was brave or reckless, because I wanted to see if the marks led somewhere. If they converged on a point or diverged from one, that would tell me something about whatever had made them. It would tell me whether the movement was purposeful. They converged. Not on a room, not on a structure, on a point in the center of a cross corridor about 100 feet ahead of me. The marks came from multiple directions, from the north, from the east, from several of the nearest doorways, and they all led to the same place. A spot on the floor where the dust was completely gone, worn down to the bare surface in a rough circle about 4 feet in diameter. And then something came here, repeatedly, from different directions, and stood in this spot. I aimed my lamp at the bare circle on the floor and noticed that the gray material there was slightly different from the surrounding surface. Not a different color exactly, but a different texture. Smoother, almost glassy, as though it had been polished by repeated contact, or as though the material itself had responded to whatever was standing on it. I realize that second interpretation sounds wrong. Floors don't respond to what stands on them. But I'm describing what I saw, and what I saw was a surface that looked like it had been shaped by use, the way a stone step wears down in the center after centuries of feet. Except this wasn't stone, and I didn't know how long the feet, or whatever they were, had been coming here. So I took a photograph of the polished circle. When the flash went off, it illuminated the corridor in both directions for a fraction of a second. And in that fraction of a second, I saw something in my peripheral vision that I did not see when the light faded. To the south, maybe 150 feet away, at the very edge of what the flash could reach, something had been standing in the corridor. I didn't get a good look. A flash photograph in a dark space gives you a single frame of visual information, and your brain processes it after the light is gone. What I retained was vertical, dark, taller than the doorways, stationary. Not a pillar. The structures had no external pillars, not a protrusion from the wall. The walls were flat. I aimed my cap lamp in that direction. The beam reached about 200 feet, and at 200 feet, the corridor was empty. Whatever I had seen, or thought I had seen, was either beyond my lamp range or had moved. I stood very still. The sound was still there, still rhythmic, still complex. I listened for something new inside it. Footsteps, movement, breathing. I heard nothing. Just the rhythm. I'm going to tell you what I did next, and I want you to understand my reasoning because, in hindsight, it looks like a poor decision, and I need you to see why it didn't feel like one at the time. I did not go toward the thing I had seen. I did not go back to Danny. I moved to the right, into one of the cross corridors, to get a different angle on the main corridor. I wanted to see whether the thing was still there from a position where my lamp beam would reach further because it wasn't fighting the same long axis. And from the cross corridor, I could look back into the main corridor at an angle. My lamp beam crossed it diagonally, giving me a view of maybe 250 feet. The corridor was empty, but the floor was not. There were new marks between where I had been standing and where I had seen the shape, in the stretch of corridor I had been looking at for the last 2 minutes. There were fresh displacement lines in the dust. They hadn't been there when I walked through. I had been observant. I had been documenting. I would have seen them. They were there now. Something had moved through the corridor while I was in it. Either while I was looking elsewhere, in the fraction of a second the flash went off and my eyes were recovering, or while I was walking to the cross corridor with my back turned, and it had moved through the space I had just been standing in, left marks on the floor, and was now somewhere I couldn't see. This is the point at which I turned around, not panicked, controlled. The way you leave a mine when you know the air is about to go bad, quickly but without running, because running uses oxygen and makes mistakes. I walked back up the main corridor toward Danny's position, and I kept my lamp aimed behind me every few steps. The corridor stayed empty behind me. The sound stayed constant. The warm air didn't change. Nothing followed me in any way I could detect. But the marks followed me. Every time I turned to look behind me and then turned forward again, there were new marks on the floor ahead of me. In the section of corridor I had already walked through, as though something was retracing my steps, but only when I wasn't looking at that stretch of floor. I tested this. I stopped, stared at a specific section of floor for 30 seconds, then turned around and stared behind me for 10 seconds, then turned back. New marks, not where I'd been staring. In the section just beyond the edge of what I'd been watching. Whatever was doing this was observing my field of vision and staying outside it. I reached Danny in about 4 minutes. He was standing by the hole with his lamp aimed into the grid of structures, and when I came into view, his expression shifted in a way I'll describe as relief, followed immediately by concern. "You were gone for 20 minutes, he said. "I know. We need to leave." "What did you find?" "I'll brief you outside. We need to leave now." Danny didn't argue. He went through the hole first. I went second, in on the other side, back in the familiar coal passage. I immediately felt the difference. The air was 54 degrees. The sound was fainter, still present, but muted by the rock between us and the void. The floor was under clay and mine debris. Normal, known. We walked out in 42 minutes. We didn't speak much. When we emerged from the drift entry into March daylight, the sky was overcast and the temperature was 38 degrees, and the world above ground felt thin and insufficient in a way I wasn't prepared for. Like a stage set. Like the real architecture was underground, and this, the trees, the hills, the road, Kowalczyk's house visible in the distance, was the model someone had built on top of it. I filed my report that evening. I described the unmapped passage, the void, the structures, the material, the marks on the floor, the sound, the warmth. I did not describe seeing a shape in the corridor. I told myself this was because I couldn't confirm what I had seen. A single frame of flash illumination is not reliable observation. That was true. It was also not the whole reason. The whole reason was that I didn't know how to write what I'd seen into a form that had checkboxes for pillar condition and roof bolt spacing. Danny filed a separate report. His was shorter than mine. He described the unmapped passage, the void, and the structures. He used the phrase, anomalous underground construction of unknown origin. He didn't mention the marks on the floor. When I asked him about this later, he said he hadn't seen them. He'd stayed by the hole the entire time I was exploring the grid. The reports went up the chain. My supervisor, Carl Henning, called me the next morning and asked me to repeat the description of the structures. I did. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he was going to make some calls and asked me not to discuss the findings outside the department until he determined the appropriate next steps. 4 days later, Carl told me a team was being assembled for a more thorough investigation. The team would include personnel from the department, a structural geologist from Penn State, and, this was the part that struck me as unusual, 2 representatives from a federal agency that Carl described only as the people who handle anomalous subsurface findings. I asked which agency. He said he'd been given a point of contact and a phone number, but not an agency name. He said this was not as unusual as it sounded. He said there were interagency agreements for situations involving underground spaces that might have military or security implications. I accepted this because it was plausible. I've since come to believe it was plausible by design. The team went in on March 19th. 7 people total. Danny and I were included as guides because we knew the route. The Penn State geologist was a woman named Dr. Annika Patel, who specialized in Appalachian Basin stratigraphy. The 2 federal representatives were men in their 40s who wore standard mining PPE and introduced themselves as Jim and Robert. No last names. They carried equipment I didn't recognize. Cases that were too heavy for their size, sealed, with no manufacturer markings. We reached the hole in the coal wall at 9:30 a.m. Everything was as Danny and I had left it. The passage, or the warmth, the sound. Dr. Patel examined the wall material and took samples. Small cores drilled with a portable rig. She didn't say much during the sampling, but I watched her face, and what I saw was someone encountering data that contradicted her priors and deciding to collect more data before reacting. I respected that. Jim and Robert set up their equipment at the entrance to the grid. Some of it was recognizably survey equipment, a total station, a laser distance meter. Some of it was not. One device looked like a seismograph, but had additional sensor arrays I didn't recognize. Another was a flat panel about 2 feet square that they placed on the floor and connected to a laptop. They worked efficiently and didn't explain what they were measuring. The rest of us proceeded into the grid. Carl had assigned me to lead the survey, so I guided the team down the main corridor, pointing out features as we went. The 12 structures on the first block, the cross corridors, the uniform dimensions, the marks on the floor. I was watching for the marks specifically because I needed to know whether they had changed since my last visit. They had. There were more of them. The convergence point, the polished circle in the center of the cross corridor, was larger. Not by much. Maybe 6 inches wider in diameter. But the dust displacement around it was more extensive, as though the traffic pattern had intensified. 8 days. The mine had been sealed for 60+ years, undisturbed. And in the 8 days since Danny and I had entered, the activity on the floor had visibly increased. I pointed this out to Carl. He looked at the marks, looked at my photographs from the first visit on my camera's display, and looked at the marks again. Could be water, he said. Mineral-laden water moving through microfractures, depositing residue. It couldn't be water. The marks had sharp edges. Water doesn't make sharp edges. But Carl was doing what I had done on my first visit, sorting the new thing into the closest available bin. I let it go. Dr. Patel was more direct. She crouched by one of the marks, examined it with a hand lens, and said, "This was made by physical contact. Something solid moved across this surface." Then she took a sample of the dust and a sample of the exposed surface beneath it and put them in labeled vials without further comment. We explored further than I had on the first visit. The grid continued for at least a quarter mile to the south, when we reached the edge of our safe exploration radius, defined by lamp time and air supply, without finding the far wall. The structures continued, block after block, identical dimensions, identical rooms, identical openings, the same gray material throughout. But there were differences I hadn't seen on my first visit. In the southern blocks, the rooms were not entirely empty. The first thing we found was in a room on the 7th block. Dr. Patel spotted it. She had been systematically checking every room we passed, shining her lamp through each opening. She called me over. On the floor of the room, near the back wall, there was a small object. It was roughly cylindrical, about 4 inches long and 1 inch in diameter, and it was made of the same gray material as everything else. It was sitting upright on the floor, perfectly vertical. It looked like nothing. That's the most accurate description I can give. It didn't look like a tool, a container, a component, a decorative item, or anything else I could compare it to. It was a cylinder of gray material, standing on end, in the back of an empty room. Dr. Patel picked it up. It was heavy for its size, she said. Dense. The surface was smooth but not slippery. She turned it in her hands and then held it up to her lamp. It's hollow, she said. There was a narrow channel running through the center, from top to bottom. You could see light through it if you held it at the right angle. She put it in a sample bag. We moved on. We found more objects in subsequent rooms. Not in every room. Maybe 1 in 15 had something in it. The objects were all different. Some were geometric, cubes, spheres, flat discs. Some were irregular, shapes that curved and branched in ways I couldn't easily describe. All were made of the same gray material. All were small enough to hold in one hand. None of them looked like anything. I've thought about this a lot. When you find a human artifact, even one from a culture you know nothing about, you can usually infer something about its purpose from its form. A blade is for cutting. A vessel is for holding. A bead is for wearing or trading. These objects resisted that inference completely. They weren't tools. They weren't art. They weren't components of something larger. They were shapes, made with precision, placed with apparent intention, and communicating nothing. At 1:15 p.m., roughly 4 hours into the survey, Jim came down the main corridor to find us. He'd been at the entrance with Robert the entire time, running whatever instruments they'd brought. His face was neutral, professionally so, in the way of someone trained not to display reactions. "We need everyone out," he said. "We're not finished surveying," Carl said. "The survey is concluded for today. We'll return with additional resources." Carl started to object. Jim said very quietly, "The readings we're getting are not consistent with a safe environment. I'm recommending immediate withdrawal." Carl looked at me. I shrugged. Jim hadn't shared his data, so I couldn't evaluate his claim. But he was federal, and federal trumps state in matters of underground safety when there's a jurisdictional overlap. We packed up and left. On the way out, I passed the polished circle on the floor. I glanced at it out of habit, and then I stopped. The circle was different, not just larger. It had a texture now, fine lines radiating from the center, evenly spaced, like the markings on a compass rose. They hadn't been there 3 hours ago when I'd walked past it on the way in. I photographed it. Jim, who was walking behind me, watched me do this, but didn't comment. Outside, in the daylight, Jim and Robert loaded their equipment into a white panel van with federal plates but no agency markings. Jim spoke briefly with Carl. I was close enough to hear part of the conversation. Subsurface thermal anomaly consistent with an active source, not geothermal. The profile is wrong. "What kind of source?" Carl asked. "That's what we need to determine. Until we do, the entry should be secured. No unauthorized access. This is a state mine." "This isn't a mine," Jim said. "What's in there isn't a mine." That was the last time I spoke with Jim or Robert. Within a week, the drift entry was sealed with a new concrete plug, thicker and more heavily reinforced than the original. A chain-link fence was installed around the portal area, and signs were posted identifying it as a federal remediation site under the authority of an interagency agreement, whose number I looked up and found corresponded to no publicly listed program. Carl told me the matter had been transferred to federal jurisdiction and that the department's involvement was concluded. He told me to finalize my report and close the file. He said this with the careful diction of someone who is reading from a mental script that was written by someone else. And I finalized my report. I closed the file. I went back to measuring subsidence and calculating pillar failure probabilities and writing remediation recommendations for old mines that were exactly what the map said they were. But I'd taken photographs. Over 200 of them across both visits. I'd taken measurements. I'd kept my field notes, which included pace counts, compass bearings, dimensional data, and observational descriptions. And I'd kept something I haven't mentioned yet. A sample. On my first visit, when I'd touched the wall of one of the structures, a small piece of the surface had come away under my fingernail. A flake about the size of a lentil. I'd noticed it when I got back to my truck and found it lodged under the nail of my right index finger. And I'd put it in a small Ziploc bag and tossed it in the center console of my truck and forgotten about it. After the site was sealed, I remembered it. I took it out and looked at it under a magnifying glass. It was gray, fine-grained, and surprisingly lightweight for something that had come from a material I'd assumed was dense. I touched it with the tip of a knife. It was hard but not brittle. It didn't chip or flake further. It had a faint warmth to it, though it had been sitting in my truck for over a week in ambient temperatures that were well below what I'd measured underground. I don't have the training to analyze materials. I know rock, I know coal, I know concrete and steel, and the handful of composite materials used in modern mining. This wasn't any of them. I thought about sending it to a lab. I didn't. I told myself it was because I didn't want to compromise what might be evidence in an ongoing federal investigation. The real reason was closer to the fact that I didn't want to be told what it was. As long as I didn't know, the thing I'd seen underground remained in a state of unresolved possibility. The moment someone identified the material, it would become one thing and stop being every other thing it might have been. And I wasn't ready for that reduction. I still have the sample. It's in a small glass vial in my desk drawer, and on cold mornings, it's warmer than the desk around it. I've measured the temperature differential. It's consistent, 6 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit above ambient, regardless of the ambient temperature. This is not possible for an inert material. An inert material reaches thermal equilibrium with its environment. This doesn't. It maintains a differential, which means it is either generating heat through some internal process or absorbing it from a source I can't detect. I check it most mornings now. Not because I expect it to change, because it already has. When I first collected it, the flake was a uniform medium gray, the same color as the walls and floor of the structures underground. Over the past weeks, it has developed a faint pattern on its surface. Not a pattern I can easily describe. It's not geometric, not organic, not random. It's more like a grain the way wood has a grain or marble has veining. Lines that flow in a direction. But the direction changes depending on the angle of the light. And last week I noticed that the pattern is denser than it was the week before. More lines, finer lines, as though the material is developing internal structure over time. I'm going to tell you what happened 3 weeks after the site was sealed. And then I'm going to stop. Because this is the point where my report ends and the territory I can't map begins. I drove out to the Kowalczyk property, not on assignment, on a Saturday. I told myself I wanted to check on the integrity of the new seal, which is the kind of thing an inspector might reasonably do. But the property was fenced and posted, and I didn't go past the fence. I parked on the county road about a quarter-mile away and sat in my truck. It was late afternoon, overcast, still. The kind of quiet you only get in rural Pennsylvania in early spring when the leaves aren't out yet and the birds are mostly elsewhere. I sat with my window down and I listened. I couldn't hear the sound and the rhythmic hum. I was too far from the entry and there was too much rock between me and the void. But I could feel it, not vibration. The surface geology wouldn't transmit a vibration from 240 feet below to a truck parked on a county road. What I felt was something else. A quality in the air. A pressure that wasn't barometric. The sense that the ground beneath me was not solid in the way I'd always assumed it was. That the surface I lived on was a thin layer of material stretched over a space that was occupied. I sat there for about an hour. The light faded. The overcast thickened to full cloud cover, and the air got colder. I was about to start the truck and leave when I noticed something through the windshield. The Kowalczyk house was about 800 feet away, across a field, and the lights were on, warm yellow rectangles in the dusk. A house, a normal house with a family in it, above a mine that was supposed to be empty. As I watched, one of the lights went off. Then another. Then they came back on. Not like someone flipping switches. The timing was wrong. They went off and on in a rhythm. A slow rhythm. Maybe 2 cycles per second, with a slight variation in amplitude. The same rhythm. I watched the lights pulse for about 30 seconds. Then they stopped and returned to normal, steady illumination. I could see a figure moving behind one of the windows. Mrs. Kowalczyk, probably, going about her evening. I started the truck and drove home. I haven't been back to that road. I filed the subsidence report recommending standard remediation for the Kowalczyk property. Grout injection to stabilize the voids beneath the house. The report makes no mention of the structures, the grid, the objects, the marks, or the sound. It recommends filling the voids with concrete. I think about that recommendation often. About what it means to fill a space you don't understand with material that will set and harden and make it inaccessible forever. About whether that constitutes remediation or burial. About the difference between those two things. The sample in my desk drawer is warmer this week than last week. The differential has increased from 6 to 8 degrees above ambient to approximately 11 degrees. The pattern on its surface has continued to develop. Last night, under the lamp on my desk, I turned the flake slowly in the light and watched the grain shift direction as the angle changed. And for just a moment, a single moment, the way the flash in the mine gave me a single frame, the pattern resolved into something coherent. Lines converging on a point. Multiple directions, all leading to the same place. A map. Or what a map might look like if it were designed by something that navigated through solid rock the way I navigate through open air. The convergence point was at the center of the flake. And at that center, in the brightest part of the lamplight, I could see that the material was slightly different. Smoother, almost glassy, as though something had been polishing it from the inside. I put the flake back in the vial. I put the vial in the drawer. I closed the drawer. The sound started last Tuesday. Not in the mine, in my house, in the basement. A low, rhythmic, layered hum, just below the threshold of identifiability. I went downstairs and stood on the concrete floor and felt it in my feet. 2 cycles per second, slight variation in amplitude, the same sound. I live in Altoona, 43 miles from the Kowalczyk property, 43 miles from the drift entry. The geological survey shows no mine workings beneath my neighborhood. The bedrock here is different, Devonian shale, not Pennsylvanian sandstone. There's no coal. There's no reason for voids. But I know what I felt, standing on my basement floor at 11 o'clock at night. I know the rhythm. I've been inside the thing that makes it. I went upstairs and opened my desk drawer and took out the vial. The flake was warm, warmer than before. The pattern on its surface was moving, not metaphorically. I held it still and watched the lines shift, slowly, the way a compass needle drifts when you bring a magnet near it. The lines were reorganizing, reorienting, pointing in a direction. Down. I put the vial back. I closed the drawer. I went to bed. I didn't sleep, but I went to bed. Below me, through the mattress and the box spring and the floor joists and the basement slab, the rhythm continued. Steady, patient, complex. I have a question that I can't put into a report. I'm going to put it here instead because someone should hear it even if no one can answer it. When Danny and I broke through that wall of coal, we thought we had discovered something. We thought we were the ones who found it. So we went in and we measured and we documented and we withdrew and we reported it as a finding. Something we had located and entered. But the marks on the floor were not 60 years old. They were fresh. The dust had been recently displaced. The polished circle was growing. The objects in the rooms were placed, not abandoned. The activity was ongoing, and it increased after our visit. More marks, faster development. A compass rose where there had been a blank spot. We didn't find it. It was already coming up. Through the coal, through the rock, through the 60-year seal and the chain-link fence and the 43 miles of Appalachian geology between that ridge in Cambria County and my basement in Altoona, we didn't break through to a city that was still there. We broke the seal on something that was already building its way toward us. The sample in my drawer is 14 degrees above ambient now. The sound in my basement hasn't stopped. The lights in my kitchen flickered last night, twice, in rhythm. My wife asked if we should call an electrician. I said yes because that's what you say. That's the bin you sorted into. But I took my shoes off this morning and stood barefoot on the basement floor, and the concrete was warm. Not 54 degrees, not 62 degrees, warm. The way those walls were warm. The way the flake in my drawer is warm. And for just a moment, standing there in my bare feet in the dark, I felt the floor shift. Not crack, not settle. Shift. The way a surface shifts when something beneath it adjusts its position. The way a ceiling moves when someone in the room above you takes a step. I stood there. I listened. The rhythm continued. And I thought about the marks on the floor of that corridor, how they converged on a single point, how the point was polished smooth by repeated contact, how whatever made those marks always stayed just outside the edge of what I could see. I thought about the grid of structures, extending beyond the reach of any lamp. I thought about the rooms, all those empty rooms, 10 by 10, the size of a bedroom, the size of a room where a person would sleep, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all empty, still empty. I put my shoes back on. I went to work. I'm at my desk now, writing this, and the vial is in my drawer, 6 inches from my right hand, and it's warm through the wood, and the pattern on the surface of the flake is still moving, still pointing down, and the sound in my basement will be there when I get home tonight. I measure what's under things. That's what I do. For 17 years, I've measured what's under things. And the answer has always been rock, coal, void, water. Known quantities, measurable quantities, things that fit in the bins I have. I don't have a bin for this. And the thing under my house, under all our houses maybe, if the grid is as large as I think it is, if it extends beyond the boundaries of what a lamp can reach and continues through bedrock and shale and clay and everything we've built on top of it. The thing underneath doesn't need me to have a bin for it. It doesn't need me to understand it, or measure it, or report it. It just needs me to be home when it arrives.